He's here, and he's come to raid your mind. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're going to take a look at the Phobos Librarian. This is the guy who came out in Shadowspear. We're continuing our look at the new Space Marine Codex and the options it has given us. And this guy has done quite well out of it, dropping in 5 points from 80 to 75. He's also gained access to a ton of new disciplines via the successor chapter books. As far as I know, he can access them. But if I'm wrong, please will someone correct me in the comments. In this review, I'm mainly going to focus on his Obscuration discipline, so that's the Phobos powers from the main Space Marine Codex. Firstly, I'd just like to say that this guy has a seriously badass model. Really liking the camo cloak and his attempt to hide a hulking blue Space Marine in bright blue armour in the middle of the battlefield. Seems to do a good enough job though, he still gets that nice +1 to his saves. So let's get into his rules then. Firstly, he costs 75 points base, but he has to take his Force Sword for an extra 8 and Camo Cloak for an extra 3, so that will bring him to a grand total of 86 points. He's got a fairly standard Primaris character stat line, with Movement 6, Weapon Skill 3, Ballistic Skill 3, Strength 4, Toughness 4, 5 wounds, 4 attacks, and 5 on the first round of combat with Shock Assault, Leadership 9, and 3 up save. He's armed with a Force Sword, Bolt Pistol, Frag and Crack Grenades, and he has a Camo Cloak. Unlike similar librarians, Games Workshop are still enforcing their policy of not giving rules to things that they don't sell, so he doesn't have the option to take a Force Axe or Force Stave like many other similar librarians do, which is a bit of a shame for customization and everything. It'd be fun to see different options for people to take and different variation in playstyles, but oh well. The Force Sword is like the regular Librarian's Force Sword, Strength User, AP -3 and D3 damage. Now his special rule is what differentiates him from regular Librarians. He can set up using the Concealed Positions rule, so that will be 9 inches from enemy models and from the enemy deployment zone. So this is a Librarian that can get very close to the enemy lines turn 1, and that can be great for hitting enemies with any offensive powers or debuffs, and supporting all the various Space Marine infiltrator units such as Scouts, Invictors, Incursors, and Infiltrators. He is naturally particularly good with the Phobos units, as a lot of his psychic powers are directly aimed at buffing and manipulating these units. He also has the Angels of Death special rule, giving him Shock Assault and Combat Doctrines, though he's only ever going to get any use out of the Assault Doctrine. I don't see that being used very much. He has his snazzy Camo Cloak, which will allow him to have a 1-up save in cover, though 1s of course always fail. And like all Space Marine Librarians, he has a Psychic Hood, which allows him to add 1 to his deny rolls if he is within 12 inches of the enemy Psyker. And his Psychic powers, he knows Smite, and 2 powers from the Obscuration discipline, which can be switched out for any 2 from the new disciplines from the new supplement books. As I said, I'm going to be focusing on the Obscuration discipline today. If you want to find out more about any of the other disciplines, then feel free to check out my other videos on the Raven Guard and Iron Hands supplements. I'll shortly have an Ultramarines and White Scars one up and done too. So without further ado, let's get into the Obscuration discipline. For our first power we have Shrouding, which is Warp Charge 6, 18-inch range, and casts on one of your friendly Phobos units. This will prevent the unit from being targeted by the enemy unless it's the closest visible unit to the firing model. Now, if this was actually unrestricted and could be applied to any unit, then I'd be a lot more impressed with this power. Unfortunately, I don't think the Phobos units are really the best targets of this. They will want to be at the front of your forces, so closest to the enemy, and they're not really the most offensive units ever. They're reasonably tanky, but they don't really put out a lot of firepower or damage for their points cost. It does, however, give your opponent less targeting options, and I guess it could be useful if you're trying to make sure that a unit on an objective doesn't die until the end of the turn. I suppose you could also use it on Eliminators, but Eliminators come in very small squads, so I'm not sure it would really be worth spending an entire psychic power just to stop your opponent killing 1 unit of them, and they're fairly tanky anyway with their 1-up saves in cover. Secondly, we have Soul Sight. Now this is a Warp Charge 6 power that again targets any Chapter Phobos unit within 18 inches of the Psyker. Until the end of your next Psychic phase, this unit can reroll all of its hits hit rolls when firing a ranged weapon, and the target ignores cover saves. I could see this working best with a big unit of infiltrators, as they have the potential to make use of both parts of the buff, or perhaps a squad of las fusel eliminators, as they're about the highest damage output Phobos unit you can get. This would of course be an absolutely amazing power if it wasn't just limited to the Phobos keyword, but I suppose that's probably why it is. Next we have Mind Raid, a Warp Charge 6 power where you pick an enemy character within 18 inches of the Phobos Librarian, and it suffers 1 mortal wound. Then you roll 3d6, and if your target beats the target character's leadership, then you gain 1 additional command point. I really like the idea of this one, the Librarian stealing secrets directly from the brains of the foe, and it could generate a few CP over the course of the game. The only worry that I have is that by having to be within 18 inches of a character, you're likely putting the Phobos Librarian at risk of reprisals, and in range of enemy psychers to try and deny him. Getting a few extra CP really isn't a bad bonus though, particularly as the new Space Marines have so many new strats and interesting options that they can use with those CP. Number 4 is Hallucination, Warp Charge 6, and selects an enemy unit within 18 inches of the psyker. The unit suffers -1 to the leadership, and the opponent rolls 2d6, and if the total is higher than the highest leadership in the unit, then the unit receives -1 to its hit rolls. I can't really say I'm much of a fan of this one, partly because you have to be close to a dangerous enemy unit, then you have to cast it and not be denied, then the only guaranteed output that you get is -1 leadership, which really isn't that much, and the opponent gets to roll those 2d6, so if he wants to use a CP on that roll, then he can. -1 to hit is a really powerful negative modifier, but I just don't see this being anywhere near reliable enough to actually make an impact when you need it to. Number 5 is a very nice one. It is Tenebrous Curse. Now I googled it, and tenebrous means dark, shadowy or obscure. Quite an appropriate definition for a word I didn't know. It's a Warp Charge 6 power that again targets a enemy unit within 18 inches and can only target enemy units that can't fly. And until the end of your next psychic phase, it halves the number for any movement, advance and charge rolls, which is just fantastic. This is going to be exceptionally powerful on melee units such as, say, Knight Gallants or Plague Bearers, or anything that you don't want hitting your front lines anytime soon. By applying this to a unit, you can know that it's not going to be up in your face anytime soon and can focus on killing other threats this turn. Again, you do have to be quite close to the enemy to do this, but if you're targeting a melee infantry unit, say like Orc Boys or Plague Bearers, then there's a very good chance they won't make the 18 inches to charge your psyker that turn anyway, and the mortal wound it does as well is just an extra little bonus. So, good stuff. And now we come to the last power in the Obscuration discipline. This one is Temporal Corridor. This is cast on a friendly chapter Phobos unit within 3 inches of the Librarian, and the unit immediately moves and advances again, and when you roll the advance roll, you roll 3d6 and pick the highest, so you have the potential to slingshot a Phobos unit an incredible distance across the board. Now this one's mainly going to be played either on the Librarian himself or on Infiltrator or Incursor units to get them into the enemy backfield. I could see this being hilariously useful on White Scars, as it could let you pull off some really long charges in the first turn. If a Phobos Librarian deployed within 9 inches of the enemy deployment zone along with one of these units, then there should be nothing in the enemy that these guys can't reach and charge turn 1, unless your opponent has actually walled himself off with his own models. So it is a little bit niche, this one, and I'm not sure if White Scars would even take it anyway, as their discipline Storm Speaking is incredibly strong in itself. So that's the end of the psychic powers. Now how can we run this guy on the tabletop and what combos exist for him? Firstly, we have the option to either make him the Warlord or to give him a Warlord trait with the Hero of the Chapter stratagem. Out of these, Lord of Deceit is probably my favourite, as it allows the Phobos Librarian to redeploy himself and up to 3 friendly Chapter Phobos units. This happens at the start of the first battle round but before the start of the first turn, so it lets you to really adapt to what your opponent has deployed and where you'd like to send your men. I also think that Master of the Vanguard also has potential use for him. This adds 1 to move, advance and charge rolls of Phobos units within 6 inches of him, so that could let them get even more ridiculous movement with his temporal corridor power, or even have him move even further as he's within range of his own aura, so that could be a extra 3 inches to his movement, temporal corridor, advance and charge if he goes off on a solo mission to do some fun commando shenanigans behind enemy lines. And thirdly, the last one I like is target priority, which lets you select a friendly Phobos unit within 3 inches of him and add 1 to the hit rolls, so that's another really solid shooting buff. So he could potentially buff 1 unit with that and the other units with the psychic power, Soul Sight. You also have the option to give him the Tome of Malkador if you really want to have a lot of the powers from the Obscuration discipline. It basically would let him know 1 extra power, but it wouldn't let him cast an extra power, so it would be more options but not more casts. And most of the time the only stratagems I'd consider on this guy would be the fight again stratagem or the only in death does duty ends to fight when he dies, to potentially offer solid targets. That's talking about stratagems from the main Space Marine book, by the way, not the other successors. In terms of chapter traits, he can certainly gain a lot from the White Scars traits by being able to advance and charge. That really adds to his first turn threat range, and either Master Artisans or the Salamander's traits can do a lot for his damage. It's usually quite good on characters because they have a small number of very good attacks. There is a successor chapter trait called Knowledge is Power that lets him reroll any 1s when he's either casting or denying, and that would certainly be very strong on a Librarian, though of course it doesn't help out any of the rest of your models in the same detachment. So, now we've had a chat about his options, how would I personally use him on the battlefield? I think you have to leverage the fact that he can deploy up the field, so you're going to want to run him along some of the Vanguard Space Marines. I'd definitely consider him if Infiltrators or Incursors, as they get the most out of his buffs. Despite the Obscuration discipline being quite strong, it really suffers from all of its buff powers from being locked to Phobos units. So I would be tempted to swap it out for one of the chapter specific disciplines. Particularly Raven Guard looks good, as he could be up the field buffing a lot of friendly Raven Guard units, as they have lots and lots of ways to get up the field early or deploy out of their deployment zone. If I had to pick Obscuration though, I would probably pick up Soul Sight and either Tenebrous Curse or Temporal Corridor, depending on the opponent. Obviously if they have lots of flyers, Tenebrous Curse isn't so great, so it's a bit matchup dependent. Even if he does just wind up casting Smite for a lot of the game, piling on some extra mortal wounds never hurts too much. I would aim to try and deploy him somewhere up the board, ideally out of line of sight, and behind either the Infiltrators or Incursors so they can screen shooting for him. If you have first turn, he could try for first turn charges alongside the Infiltrators and Incursors after they've laid down a lot of bolter fire, aided by Soul Sight. So in conclusion, I would rate him as moderately competitive. I don't think I would run him in most games, but in certain lists I could certainly see him being used. Out of the successor chapter psychic trees I've seen so far, I most like the Raven Guard and White Scars ones, both of which will be great on him. I'll try and talk about that a bit more when I do my White Scars video. Thanks very much for listening. I feel like this guy has a lot more potential when used in the hands of someone intelligent, as he's got a lot of small tricky powers that require clever positioning close to the enemy. If anyone's had any great success with him, I would really like to hear it, so please feel free to post down in the comments. I'll be continuing my review of Space Marine units and the successor chapters shortly. I'm thinking about a video on Leviathan Dreadnoughts as the next one, and then maybe a review of the Ultramarines Codex after that. So feel free to subscribe if you would like to see more Space Marine content like this.